Hello, everyone. My name is SHAHIN, and I'm a data curator with the nonprofit Prior Art Library, Porta Sofia. I'm here to talk to you today about Porta Sofia as a resource, considerations for psychedelic patenting. All right, just to give a general overview of what I'm going to be talking about today, we're going to be first going over current problems in psychedelic patents, Porta Sofia's intervention strategies, and then examples of our impact. So one of the largest issues that the psychedelic field is currently facing is that there's been a stark increase in overly broad patent applications that have been filed per year, over 600% increase within the 5 years alone. Now, when we say overly broad, what we mean is that the claims within these applications encompass information that is already in existence in the public domain, meaning that it's already been published upon scientifically, within books, websites, public online forums, etc. Now, given the fact that patents are essentially government-sanctioned monopolies, if these overly broad claims are granted, then this information will be removed from public applicability, and this information will be privatized, which can hurt the field as well as innovation within this space. And not only that, but certain applications have also made quite a splash, not only in the psychedelic field, but have also drawn the attention of mainstream news outlets for their overly broad claims. For example, this particular application includes the set and settings in which psychedelics are applied. Now, given the fact that prior art does establish that these particular aspects are included for decades prior to this particular application's filing, well, the problem is that that prior art may be relatively difficult to find because of the unique history of psychedelic compounds. Now, I don't need to tell you, obviously, they've already been studied for millennia by indigenous cultures, robustly studied in Western medicine in the early 20th century before being broadly outlawed. And then, after that, research was driven underground. And because of that, there are more unique means of reporting results in recent years. And because this prior art is more difficult to find and patent examiners are not trained in the history of psychedelics, may go missed, and these overly broad claims may be granted. So this is really where Porta Sofia hopes that we can make an impact, just to give a general workflow of our strategy. First and foremost, we track psychedelic patents and applications using patent search engines, screening for 33 psychedelic and, more broadly speaking, hallucinogenic compounds. We then evaluate these patents and applications and sort them through our tiered system, looking at the overall scope of the claims, their breadth, as to whether they contain information that is already within the public domain. We then take a look at the applicant's history as to whether they have filed overly broad patent applications in the past, and whether the data that is included within that particular application supports the overall scope of those claims. And finally, we evaluate whether the threat to research and innovation that is posed by those claims is significant enough to warrant our attention. We then identify patent categories and curate patent themes in order to identify prior art, so broadly speaking, looking at the specific compounds, the medical indication, synthesis methods, route of delivery, etc. And then, if the time frame is right, we would then file a third-party pre-issuance submission or observations for those particularly egregious applications. We then find and curate prior art specific to those claims. First, doing a general web-based search for more traditional means of prior art, including patents, scientific journal articles, websites, etc. And then we also have a secondary screening method of archival prior art as well. And then we curate that. So individuals that have a strong legal as well as scientific background then select keywords, quotes, and summaries, and we upload that onto the Porta Sofia Prior Art Library, where not only do we have these tier-sorted applications and patents, but also prior art specific to the themes derived therein. And we actually just reached a big milestone recently. And we have over 600 pieces of curated prior art in our online library that is specifically derived from modern patenting themes. So from this workflow, we've developed a two-prong approach. The first being more passive in nature, generating and building our psychedelic prior art library. And our second being a little bit more direct, where we are submitting prior art directly to the patent examiners that are charged with evaluating these claims in third-party pre-issuance submissions and observations. So going a little more into our first prong, Porta Sofia in and of itself is a simple search tool for psychedelic prior art with specialist curated summaries and descriptions of psychedelic prior art from a broad variety of sources. It has a very easy method for refining results by date, prior art type, focus area, as well as for additional compounds and keywords. And search terms are highlighted within the curation for ease of identification. And not only do we have more conventional means of acquiring prior art, but we also leverage historical knowledge in order to shape the present through our archival researcher network, which is an international network of historians and archival researchers that specialize in psychedelics, where essentially we crowdsource archival prior art based on patent-derived themes, which expands our library with a unique historical set of documentation relevant to modern patenting. Now transitioning to more direct approach. So we've only begun pursuing this particular method just late last year, and we have filed against a broad cross-section of assignees ranging from private companies, public-private universities, as well as government agencies, looking at a broad cross-section of psychedelics for many different medical indications as well. And despite the fact that we've only, again, been pursuing this within the last year, we've already seen some significant action from the applicants in amending their overly broad claims in response to the prior art that we submitted. Thank you. And what's really important to note here is that the applicants are actually taking it upon themselves to narrow the scope of these claims without direction from the Patent Office. So I'm going to go into a little bit more one of the particular applications that has responded as such. And it's actually one that I opened this presentation with. So we decided to pursue a third-party pre-issuance submission against this application because of the very broad claims that encompass well-established information that it included. The data presented also did not support the breadth of the claims, and it's a part of a series of psychedelic-focused patent applications filed by this particular entity. So we, together with legal experts as well as scientific experts, assembled a cross-section of prior art and then showed where within that prior art and how it is applicable to each individual claim of that application. So we assembled 39 pieces in total that addressed all 162 claims of this application, and it came from a broad cross-section of sources ranging from academic book chapters, peer-reviewed journals, both domestic as well as international patent documentation, online public forum entries, news articles, and even vendor product description websites. And as a result, within this amendment, about 5 to 6 months after we submitted our third-party submission, the applicant took it upon themselves to narrow the scope of their claim from focusing on psilocybin to the crystalline polymorph that they had previously been granted patent rights over, drastically narrower than it was beginning. And we're putting it back together with the set and setting claims that I opened this particular presentation with. All of those have also been canceled as a result, so they are no longer on the table. However, though we cannot say for certain that it was directly because of our third-party submission that this particular entity decided to change course, it does show that psychedelic prior art needs to be made more easily accessible, because not only for the patent examiners that are evaluating these claims, but also for the innovators that may not have known that they were overstepping the bounds of the public domain in the first place. And it's important that they gain this information early on because the cost of filing and maintaining a patent application is significant. And if you're looking to do this in an international scale, that would increase exponentially. And the optics will also likely be damaging because though these individuals are simply trying to bring their psychedelic therapies to market and get them into the hands of the people that need them, if they overstep the bounds of the public domain, the blowback from that can be significant to their bottom line. So we here at Porta Sophia hope that we can be a solid resource not only for patent examiners, but also for the innovators that are hoping to make an impact in this field by gaining a more informed take on the public domain and then making informed intellectual property decisions to increase the likelihood of their patenting success. So thank you, of course, to all of our collaborators and our supporters, and thank you so much for your time. We invite you to visit our website and learn more about us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaheen. Next, we'll hear from Jack GRIEM. Jack concentrates his practice on intellectual property disputes and related litigation. He advocates for clients in patent, trademark, copyright, and trade secret cases involving the pharmaceutical, diagnostic testing, medical products, and consumer electronics sectors, among others. Jack possesses a particularly in-depth knowledge of the issues that surface in complex pharmaceutical patent litigation under the Hatch-Waxman Act. In the psychedelic arena, Jack represents freedom to operate in its patent advocacy and U.S. Patent and Trademark Office challenges, in addition to representing Ceruvia Life Sciences and Be More in IP matters. Welcome, Jack GRIEM.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to take a little time talking about patents, particularly as they apply to classic psychedelics. I'm here primarily because of my work with freedom to operate. Freedom to operate is a term that's very common in patent law, and it's used to describe the process of checking to make sure that you're not infringing anyone else's patents. But it's also the name of a not-for-profit public charity that's doing some very important work trying to push against some of the overbroad patents that SHAHIN just told us about. So just a minute or two on why we should care about patents. Everyone has talked about patents. What do they give you? They give you one of the most powerful rights that a government can grant. Until the patent expires, and that's 20 years after it's filed, if you get this patent, you have a right to go to court and stop your competitor or anyone from using the invention that's claimed in the patent. And you can see why this is particularly important in the pharmaceutical area. Once a drug is out on the market, it can be copied, usually for very little money, some chemical work. You figure out how to make it and package it, and then you sell it potentially as a generic, and that has a big effect on the price. So getting patents, having pending patent applications has always been a marker of innovation and economic advantage in the pharmaceutical area. Even if a patent is pending, people worry about it. Once it's granted, it becomes a real and present threat to anyone that is selling a drug that meets the terms in the claims of the patent. And that's by design. If you've done the work, you're supposed to have this exclusivity because it's been checked by an examiner. Now, SHAHIN just told us about some of the limitations on the prior art areas in psilocybin. I'll talk about in a minute. And finally, if you have a patent and it covers your approved drug, it gives you a tremendous advantage in litigation against potential generics. You will get a chance to stop those generics from being launched for up to 2.5 years while you litigate the drug, while you litigate the patents. So I'm going to skip through this a little bit because you just heard some of the important points. Psychedelics, classic psychedelics are old. MDMA was created by Merck in 1912. Alexander Shulgin reported on its effects in humans in 1978. And in that time, it's been used by probably millions of people who have reported on its effects in internet postings, in research, and in other ways. LSD was synthesized in the 1930s by Albert Hofmann. He discovered its psychoactive effects in 1943. Psilocybin was synthesized and isolated from mushrooms by Albert Hofmann in the 1950s. Mescaline and ayahuasca have been traditional medicines used for centuries. So these materials are not the typical target of a pharmaceutical product because you cannot get a patent, or you're not supposed to be able to get a patent on the substance itself. Only potentially new uses or new ways to administer the drug, or things that aren't already out there and known by people who've used the material. So how could anyone get a patent on a classic psychedelic? Well, these are some of the things that were just talked about. There are limited databases. Porta Sophia is a tremendous step forward in addressing that issue. Modern analytical techniques. So since these materials developed, there are new ways to analyze the materials and try to figure out something new about their structure. Their polymorphic form is a primary example. You can figure out the polymorphic form of material using something called X-ray powder diffraction, XRPD. The patent office only knows what's in front of it. So if you present a patent application saying you have invented a polymorph and that polymorph is not in the prior art, they are going to assume you were right because you're claiming to have invented it. And you get a patent on it. There's a tremendous amount of social knowledge that's out there. Clusterbusters, for example, has done a tremendous amount of work making knowledge about anecdotal uses of psilocybin and other materials available. That is also prior art that a patent examiner is not likely to find. And also, patent applications don't require that you prove the clinical utility in anything that approaches what's required for the FDA. If you say that it's going to work and you have a plausible scientific basis, you'll probably get the patent in the United States. You won't in other countries, but you will in the US. And even a testing in a few mice with something that might indicate utility is usually enough. So, Compass Pathways is a company that has, I'm going to use as an example in this area, it's also been the subject of some of the activities of freedom to operate. Not all of them, but some of them. So they filed a patent application in 2018 describing their scale-up research to make psilocybin. And they did X-ray testing, this X-ray powder diffraction testing that I talked about. They claim to have invented 2 new forms, polymorph A and hydrate A. They've gotten patents on those 2 materials, both as standalone materials and for depression. And they are seeking patents on the use of these forms of psilocybin for every kind of condition that you can imagine having to do with the nervous system. Freedom to Operate. Freedom to Operate was founded a few years ago by KAREY Turnbull when he recognized that there was a problem here, that the crystal forms of psilocybin must be in the prior art, that if other people can follow this polymorph pattern in getting patents, it's going to be a real problem for research for every company looking at classic psychedelics. So Freedom to Operate has done 3 things. We have filed challenges in the patent office, putting together scientific evidence showing that these polymorphs that Compass claims to have invented are in the prior art. And I have no time to go through the details of that, but I urge you to go to our website, freedomtooperate.org, where we have posted all of this information, and you can read the peer-reviewed science that backs all this up. We sent Compass an open letter telling them that hydrate A was known in the prior art. We've received no response. And we commissioned original research on LSD D-tartrate, the most common form of LSD, the salt form, and we published that research and sent it to Porta Sofia to be added to their library. So our polymorph A petitions have had some trouble, but they are currently still being reviewed. And it illustrates the difference between what a scientist, a crystallographer will understand, and what a patent examiner looks at based on the law that he or she is taught to apply. That even a 0.1 difference in one of five peaks makes all the difference from a patent point of view. Now, that is not the case in Canada, it's not the case in India, it's not the case in the EPO, but it is unfortunately the case here and in the UK, and that has allowed Compass to get these patents. So the Hydrate open letter, I think, is a great example of the benefits that can come from doing research into the prior art. So Freedom to Operate, working with researchers at USONA and elsewhere, asked for a sample of the psilocybin that was held by the National Institute on Drug Abuse Supply. Anyone can ask for this. Compass could have asked for it. When we tested that material, which was made in 1963, at Sandoz, it was 100% hydrate A. Compass has not disclaimed its patents on hydrate A. This LSD crystal form research established that there is basically one crystal form, and because we have now made it public, no one from this point on should be able to get a patent on a crystal form of LSD D-tartrate. So the question for you all to take away from this as you hear about this discussion is, with respect to classic psychedelics, things that are already known and have been in use for a while, is patenting the right use of resources? And again, please look at our website for any follow-up questions you have. Thank you.
For our next speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce KAREY Turnbull, who will be joined on stage by Tiffany KAREY. KAREY Turnbull has extensive business experience founding and selling several companies in the energy services sector. Prior to his business career, Mr. Turnbull lectured about and taught meditation for 10 years. Mr. Turnbull is chair of the advisory board of the NYU Center for Psychedelic Medicine and has assisted in the founding of Yale University's psilocybin research program. He is a member of the board and president of Hefter Research Institute and member of the board of USONA Institute, both of which promote research on psychedelic plants and drugs at leading university research departments. Since 2010, Mr. Turnbull has worked in commercial early-stage drug development for half a dozen companies as an investor, founder, and CEO. He founded Real Life Sciences and Be More to transform psychedelic research into cutting-edge medicine. Most recently, he founded Freedom to Operate to protect psychedelic science and medical development for the public benefit. Mr. Turnbull also provides time as an adjunct advisor to the legal defense of the Native American Church and other indigenous peoples' rights to the practice of their religion, ceremonies, beliefs, free from cultural, religious, and legal pressure. Tiffany KAREY is an award-winning journalist who covers psychedelics, cannabis, alcohol, and tobacco for Bloomberg News and Business Week magazine. Her weekly newsletter, The Dose, is a must-read for those following the psychedelics industry. Let's welcome KAREY Turnbull and Tiffany KAREY to the stage.
Thanks. Great.
So, KAREY, I understand this is not your first Horizons conference.
Not my first.
How many times have you been here before?
I was to Horizons first time about 12 years ago, and it was a sketchy group of people in a church somewhere, and all of us were trying to make sure that no one would really see us there. I was like, who sees me, or does somebody recognize me? So this has changed a lot.
Well, it is a privilege to interview you here and talk about your work, which I had the privilege of finding out about a few months ago when NYU announced its really impressive results on psilocybin and alcohol use disorder. And I got to find out who was behind some of that great work with the funding that you and your wife have done. So I just want to open it up to you to talk more about how you came to this area and what all those impressive things we just heard in your bio really mean.
So how I came to this area. First of all, I'll say that the subject here, which is patents, commons, innovation, and competition, is the least fun thing that has anything to do with psychedelic science. Something I've been thrilled about working on for a dozen years. This sucks all the fun right out of it. But I have been forced by circumstances to become familiar with some of this stuff, and so I've been invited to talk a little bit about it. But as to how I got interested in this, I'll right away go back 50 years and give it up. I took LSD about 50 or 60 years ago, and it was one of the most astonishing experiences I thought was possible for a human being to have. Now, I was just a kid in high school, and I don't recommend, somebody don't do these things at home or some such warning, but it was astonishing as a probe of mood and cognition. Astonishing enough that my life began to circle around that experience, and but I moved away from it, and like some of the other people who had been astonished by LSD, and I'll say, Richard Alpert was Timothy Leary's sidekick at Harvard, and he went over to India, and he came back in a sacred dressing gown, and he nicknamed himself after a Hindu god. And the Beatles, who similarly, world's biggest pop stars, writing songs about girls and holding hands, and then they take LSD, and then the song is Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Here's the world's greatest rock band winking at youth culture. But then they went over to India also and came back, and so I did the same thing. I learned to meditate. I became a teacher of meditation, as the bio said, and I taught meditation for about 10 years. That's where I met my wife, Claudia. We both taught meditation. And so 10 years went by, and then we had a child, and then the proverbial shit hits the fan. We had been living as itinerants, renting an odd room in an attic somewhere, not the slightest interest in anything other than what we were doing. And so at that point, I realized I'm not just a husband, I'm a father and a breadwinner and a head of household, and I need to do something. And so fortunately, a good friend of mine, try to tell your life story in 8 minutes and see if it doesn't get emotional. So fortunately, a good friend of mine who I'd known from the meditation group said, I got this job on Wall Street, and you're not so dumb. You may not have the background that other people in the office have. You didn't go to an Ivy League school. You didn't spend a decade in industry. Most of the people in here have got all that, and you don't, but you're not so dumb. You proverbial start in the mailroom, and so act as our receptionist for a little while. And I came home after the first day, and I said to Claudia, this isn't going to work. I don't know that I can do this. So our goal was, I'm going to do it for a year, and we'll save $30,000, and then we go back to the peaceful life that we had, doing odd jobs, painting houses, but teaching meditation is what I wanted to do, and what we both wanted to do. And now in trying to get through my life in 8 minutes, I don't know where the thing is here, I'll just jump ahead.
And then the clinical trial came up.
What's that?
The clinical trial.
The critical trial, we'll get to the trial. 25 years go by and it becomes the largest interdealer broker of energy derivatives in the world. And I am the principal owner and the chairman, so I have tremendous real-world experience. During the time I was involved in this intensely competitive career, I kept up my meditation practice. I meditated for 2 hours every day for 40 years. And so now our kids have gotten out of school, but now a dark night of the soul. What have I done? And it wasn't, why did I take the career and the wife and family? It was, why have I kept up this practice for 40 years, tens of thousands of hours of meditation? And I knew, I'd never forgotten, I was circling that experience. But in this dark night of the soul, trying to figure out, was that a crazy hallucination I had on some stupid drug that was a cartoon, or was it the experience that I thought it was? And then I saw on the internet my favorite scientific study of all time, dose-specific response to psilocybin reliably occasions mystical-type experiences of lasting and meaningful value. And I thought, that is my biography right there, in a sentence. And so I was like, who's doing these things? Where's our time check, by the way? I don't see any. I don't my life in 8 minutes. Do I have 3 or 4 minutes left here?
You've got a few minutes, yeah.
Okay. So I called Johns Hopkins, because this was not some sketchy article in High Times magazine. This was a highly credentialed psychopharmacologist at the Johns Hopkins behavioral psychopharmacology lab. So it was Roland Griffiths. So I called and I said, I'm really curious about this study. And can I get into one of these studies? And they said, well, the one we're doing now, the inclusion criteria is you have to have had a diagnosis. And I said, I'm dying to be in your study. Does that qualify? And they said, no, that doesn't work for you. But I did come to know they were doing a companion study at New York University, and I'm from New York, so I called there, and again, I donated $1,000 or $2,000 thinking I got on their email distribution list. And so Steve Ross, the fellow doing the study, I went in touch with him, and he said, I'd love to have you come in and talk. And I thought, this guy must have, like, Keith Richards and Paul McCartney, like, millions of dollars and all these old rock stars. But I was very kind of him, so I went. And sure enough, and it's not that I'm a stranger to big industrial buildings. I had a long career working on an elite level in the business community of New York. But here he is, sure enough, he's in this hospital, very modern building, and I knock on the door, and there's 6 or 7 people in there. And you were one of them, I'm sort of. Anyway, there were 6 or 7 people in there, and I said, I have the wrong room. And they said, no, this is Dr. Ross's room. And I said, I'll come back when you're done with your meeting. I said, no, we're here to see you. I said, I sent you $2,000, you're here to see me? And I recognized right away it was a field in which there was tremendous resource scarcity. I'm going to take a drink of water in my life in 8 minutes. I got 2 or 3 left, I think.
And I think that is a great summary of this metaphysical, thoughtful journey that you were on to this place. And then somehow you went from being this very spiritually oriented, searching person to being a patent geek. What happened? How do patents play a role today? Why have they been an issue that have been really important for you?
They've become the complicated part. For the next couple of years, what happened was there was nothing good academia. It was 2010, and the psychedelic renaissance had not yet occurred. Claudia and I became the largest donors to Steve's cancer anxiety trial. It was $950,000. We ended up providing most of the resources, financial resources for that. It was published in December 2016, which is when Roland Griffiths and Steve Ross's studies were published in a high-impact peer-reviewed journal. That's the point where I could walk up and down in front of Bloomberg with like sandwich boards. LSD is cool, and nobody, they just walk right by me. Here it is in a peer-reviewed journal, really great science. So, but Steve said to me in 2012, 2 years after I'd met him, my real passion is substance abuse, addiction. He said in the 1950s and 60s, the largest subject studied in psychiatry was psychedelics, and it was depression and addiction. And although Hefter, the foundation I become introduced to, was doing a lot of work on, mostly on depression. That was what they'd gone to. And Steve said, I'm an addiction psychiatrist. I want to start that again. So we had a bit of a conference at NYU. We invited everyone in the entire field, which is about 10 people, and they were at this conference, and how can we make a study to test the idea that these things are useful in substance abuse. So they come up with a protocol. It took 3 or 4 months. One of the people invited was Michael Bogenschutz. He's a National Institute of Drug Abuse clinical trial network supervisor. And he had done a small trial that Bill Linton had sponsored for about $100,000. And one of the people there who was very senior at NYU in medical school looked at that and he said, if you replicate that study in a larger trial, this will become the frontline treatment for substance abuse in the world. And so that convinced me these are people who have credentials and know what we're doing. So my wife and I donated the money, along with a few other people. It ended up being a $3.5 million study. We'd started with $2 million. We were joined by very generous donations from Andrew Mason, from Bill Linton, from Cody Swift, from David Bronner. It's the usual suspects. It was very small. We wrote them in 2012. This was still, you needed the usual suspects to get anywhere near this sort of situation. So that's the trial that just published in JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, in August. Peer-reviewed, really sensational trial saying that, yes, psilocybin is useful in the treatment of substance abuse disorders. And if we can replicate that trial with the next set of trials, it will become the frontline treatment for substance abuse in the United States. So there is my biography in 10 minutes.
And so tell us how you came to understand the importance of patents and exclusivity and what the sort of economic factors are, how this compares to the pharmaceutical industry, or is it completely different?
Yes, and this is the part that's come up in the last couple of years. I'm not a patent attorney, but then you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. So my talk won't be technical as poor Sophia's and as Jack was. My business experience tells me you get the best in class and you delegate to them the things that you think need to be done. But you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. Now, Bob Dylan said that. I give it up right away. I don't try to pretend I'm clever and that I made up that thing. That's a Bob Dylan line from about, he got the Nobel Prize for it. So let's put a pin in that. You didn't invent things, you heard from someone else. Duh. As to my expertise, I was talking to Tim Ferriss one time, and he said to me after some conversation, oh, so you're a patent attorney? I said, no. He said, but you're an attorney. I said, no, not that either. He said, so you're a clinician or a psychopharmacologist? I said, no. He said, oh, you're an autodidact. And I thought, we're having a perfectly friendly conversation. Now he starts calling me names. So I went home and I looked that up and I saw, oh, that's a compliment. That means you're self-taught. being self-taught and being an autodidact, I can demonstrate to everybody here that we don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows in terms of where did psychedelics come from and what their value is. You can't patent something you didn't invent. For instance, when Albert Hofmann, I can say, stumbled across LSD, Sandoz had told him, look at these argotamines and see how they affect the cardiovascular system. The dose of LSD, which causes an overwhelming experience, is so small that if you put it on the table in front of you and use the jeweler's loop, you'd have real difficulty seeing what you just put there. It's that small. So he got it in his mouth or his nose or something, famous bicycle day. He accidentally found that he was looking for something to affect the cardiovascular system, this overwhelming psychoactive experience, takes his bicycle home. He comes back and he says to Sandoz, I think I stumbled across something. This is wildly psychoactive. It may indicate the neurological basis for both disorders, depression, schizophrenia, but also on the other side, it may also indicate the exact flip side of that coin, which is human flourishing. So he said, so I think I've discovered something. About a month later, they gave it to another fellow in the office just to see was that an accident, was it really true. He had the experience. He did not run back into the office and say, oh my God, I discovered something, because he knows if someone gave you something and told you about it, you didn't invent it. Duh. So now let's talk a little bit about real property, tangible property, houses and cars, versus intellectual property. Intellectual property is intangible. So again, it doesn't take a genius. ASCAP is where artists do. If you write a song, John Lennon wrote Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. He goes to ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Professionals. You register, it's my song. If somebody comes along 5 years later and they say, I have a song I want to register. And if the person they're talking to doesn't know the Beatles, and he says, here's how it goes, and he starts to sing Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, the guy might just stamp it and say, fine, there's your song. Then later on, somebody from John Lennon's estate has to come along and say, no, actually, that's a song somebody else did. So that's ASCAP, where you register these sorts of things. And that's in art. Now we talk about the pharma trade, where, as Jack said, there are extraordinary rights given out for, typically in our system, we don't allow monopolistic behavior because it produces egregious pricing ambition. And so typically we broke up big oil in the early 20th century. We break up big tech. I'm not a technophobe, I don't have a dog in that hunt, but there's concern about big tech, maybe being too big, too monopolistic. Again, I'm not a technophobe, I don't care about that. There are certain places where we award monopolies. One is the electricity business. You have one electricity provider, it's thought to be in the public interest, it's efficient, it's economically beneficial. Another is the pharmaceutical industry, where they actually have rules where they will award a monopoly to someone who discovers something novel. And they do that to encourage people. Science is not the review of things that we know, it's the attempt to discover something that no human being ever knew before. And in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, cures for previously incurable, terrible illnesses.
And Carey, I just want to make sure we have time to talk about all the amazing things you've done with Be More and Ceruvia. Can you talk a little bit about how
Thank you. I thought somebody was going to come with the 2-minute thing, but I guess they're not doing that for the little sections. Let's go to that, because I think that Jack and Prof. Sophia covered very nicely the difficulties and complexities of the patent office. So, yes.
So Ceruvia has been looking into some of the work that you've helped to fund at Yale. Can you talk a little bit about what that research is looking into and how patents are important to help the work get done?
Yes, so commercialization, those of us who have been involved in this for 15 or 20 years are pleasantly surprised by the fact that we are finding that we are proving medical benefit, which is the definition of Schedule 1, and a lot of it has been Schedule 1 says no in medical benefit. The first things out were MAPS. MAPS and Hefter, the two organizations, have been doing this for 20 years or so. MAPS has primarily worked on MDMA to treat PTSD. It's an empathogen. Hefter has worked on classic psychedelics. And so as these, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years ago, began to actually show enough promise that it actually began to appear we could make prescription medicines out of them, I assumed this would be something my grandchildren might be able to see. So well-known MAPS is doing the trials, MDMA to treat PTSD. The first one's out on classic psychedelics, where this December 16th, or December 2016 publication of these trials showing that psilocybin does treat depression. And so, so depression was the first up. And so USONA, started by Bill Litton, one of the people on the Hefter board, and Compass, who had heard about the fact that this research was done, both went to the FDA to make a prescription medicine out of those. And as I saw that happening, so I was on the Hefter board, and I see these things beginning to happen, I think, I'll just clean up the stuff falling off the back of the truck, which is, we'd been doing research at Yale to use psilocybin to treat neurological disorders, headaches. Bob Bold is here, who's the founder and chair of Cluster Busters, who is the person at whose conference I met Emanuel Schindler, who's a neurologist at Yale and doing research on headaches. And then there was this trial that was almost finished on psilocybin to treat alcohol use disorder, which just published. So thinking, okay, these things are extraordinarily expensive, $100 million to make a prescription medicine. We've kind of had people talk about this here. But I'm thinking, I'm in a catbird seat. I see the different pieces here. There's Michael Bogenschutz's $4 million trial, just about finished. Bill Linton had formed USONA to begin to create GMP psilocybin and do the preclinical toxicology necessary for the FDA to allow you to do these trials. Bill, the largest donor to psychedelic science in the history of the human race, getting up there and just extraordinary. So I thought, he's my friend and I know what he's doing, and here's this other trial. If I put these pieces together and just follow their pattern, so Claudia and I formed a company, Be More, and
Can you tell everyone who Be More is named after? I think that's a really important detail.
So Claudia's brother died of a drug overdose. Sorry. It was 50 years ago, and we haven't gotten over it. His name was Brett Moore. B. Moore, we took the space out between the period and the M and took one of the O's out. Admittedly, it's a very clever psychedelic double entendre, but at the same time, B. Moore is the company that we formed. We put a couple $1 million into it and said, the pieces are here. The IND-enabling preclinical toxicology is a 10-year, $25 million get that Bill had just gotten out there and started doing. Claudia and I donated about $5 million to that campaign. The Colemans donated about $5 million to it. Very expensive, very time-consuming, but that was in the can. We now have about 40 employees. They have taken us through a pre-IND meeting and later on an IND meeting with the FDA where we presented the preclinical toxicology, which is the safety they want to see. Michael Bogenschutz, National Institute of Drug Abuse official, came to the meeting, and we now have an open IND to do exactly what is being done with psilocybin for depression and with MDMA for PTSD. We have 15 sites lined up, and they're the who's who of psychedelic research: Harvard, Yale, NYU, Johns Hopkins, UCSF, 4 or 5 CROs, contract research organizations that also do this sort of work. And so we are on the verge of starting a multi-site trial to do what in 2012 that person said, if you replicate these results, this will become the frontline treatment for substance abuse. And so we're on the verge of starting that in Be More. Ceruvia is another company we formed to take the work done at Yale on headaches and on OCD to treat neurological disorders. These things
Would
are.
any of this have been possible without patents? I mean, there are patents involved, and I think it's important to distinguish between.
Yes, so here we get into
blocking
patents, the good and the bad and the ugly.
Yeah.
Ceruvia and Be More's IP is licensed from its owners, Harvard, Yale, and NYU. It's much of the core clinical research that's produced the psychedelic renaissance, done over the past 15 years by 3 of the country's top research medical schools. Medical schools are nonprofits. They have vast intellectual property portfolios, titanium hips, heart valves, medical, psychoactive, medicines for all sorts of mental disorders. And so those are the people who own that intellectual property. Having donated the money to them, that's their intellectual property. So we've licensed that in order to do just what those medical schools do well, which is they see the commercialization. They're not into ivory tower. The fact that human lifespans have doubled in the last 50 years, much of that comes from medical schools and the work they've done. And the fact that they have commercialized those things with partners in commerce. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think it's time to invite the others back up on stage.
Is that 24 seconds left? I don't quite know where
I saw it at 0 a minute ago. Maybe I need glasses.
Okay. So thanks. That's my story. That's my life in 8 minutes, and then 8 minutes about a few other things.
So I think Jack and Shaheen are going to join us, and we can set up some crosstalk about all the different ideas going on up here.
Yes. And I'm sorry I didn't leave more time for you to ask me a question or two. And please do ask me a question or two. And I think we have 10 minutes or something here.
Yeah, I think that the
Okay.
the articulation you made before between a blocking patent and other kinds of patents is really interesting to sort of understand why some patents can be troublesome, like some of the ones that Shaheen is looking at. And why sometimes patents are necessary. So maybe I'll open that up to all of you to talk about, how do you distinguish between when a patent is really needed, when it's beneficial, and the bad and the ugly?
Yeah. So blocking patents, implying that you invented a classic psychedelic, and the classics mescaline, LSD, psilocybin, maybe ayahuasca, maybe 5-MeO, I don't know what you want to call a classic, but it's a pretty short list. Blocking patents to prevent, when you have a patent, you're given this extraordinary right to prohibit other people from producing and distributing it. And there's always a tussle when that right, which is given out by the pharma industry, by the FDA and the USPTO, it lasts for 5 or 10 years, and then when that's over, then generics enter the market. And generics attempt to be the high-quality, low-cost provider in an equitable fashion to the public. And there's always a bit of a tussle between the person with the patent and the generics that want to undercut their price by like 20, 25, 30, 50, 80%. We don't want to have to go to Canada or Mexico to get our meds, and so that's all in the public's best interest. And so a blocking patent would be one that attempts to have a monopoly for a classic psychedelic, which would be, I think, abhorrent. And there are other patents that say, okay, so they're use patents, and not only use patents, but use, and so how many administrations with what dose, and those are the kind of things that medical schools are good at teasing out, that kind of detailed information, and having a patent that will facilitate the ability of that kind of a medicine to get in people's hands safely and efficiently. But it's different from a blocking patent.
How is the legal situation when it comes to patents? Is the law very clean-cut on differences between novel molecules, classic molecules?
That's a good question. In the area of classic molecules, it is certainly possible to make invention. These studies are discovering new things about the best way to administer the drugs, the amounts to use, how to select the patients, how to support the patients before and afterwards. And where an invention is made, the universities are interested in preserving that intellectual property. That's their responsibility as universities. In materials that have never been known before, derivatives that either have been known but no one knows what they're for, or completely novel drugs, you're looking at a much more conventional pharmaceutical patent strategy where you try to capture the patent on on the molecule itself. Now, I don't think that answers the broader ethical question of whether that's the right strategy for materials like the psychedelics that have such an amazing breadth of promise. But we have a lot of promise with the classic psychedelics we know, and I think the focus is on making sure that there's no overclaiming in that area.
And Shahin, can you tell us more about prior art, which is such a fascinating term when it comes to psychedelics, because this is something that people have been, there's cave art related to psychedelics from millennia ago. So, when you look at prior art, how much legwork does that involve? How sticky is that to establish? How does that work differently with things like dosage versus therapy? What are the roles of different native practices and underground practices that might have established some prior art around these substances?
So I'm assuming everyone can hear me. Are we good? All right, cool. So broadly speaking, prior art is anything that has been established prior to as patent applications filing, so that information has been out there. So when it comes to psychedelic prior art, why it's so unique, why it's coming into question so much more, and why that definition is kind of becoming expanded as a result. So this underground research wasn't as scientific in nature as what we are now pursuing. So even when we're talking about dosages specifically, we've gone back to pieces of prior art that have looked at psilocybin content of various different psychoactive mushrooms, all the way back to the 1980s. Just a simple organic chemistry paper didn't get that much traction. But now, because an individual posted on an online forum that they took this particular species of mushroom in a certain amount of grams, we were then able to cross-reference that to this existing prior art in the 1980s that then shows that it's within the dosage range that is now being claimed as novel and non-obvious in modern patent applications. And that was something that was seen as viable and was actually cited in one of our claims amendments, and also as one of our 9 final rejections for, I'm not sure if you guys, it was the Yale application that we were discussing. I wish I had the number available on me. But that was seen as one of the determining factors as to why the claims that were relating to that dosage were not going to be allowed by the Patent Office as a result. So the Patent Office has thankfully been allowing a little bit more flexibility in taking not only this more underground research approach, but also going back into more of the base organic chemistry that then establishes that that can be prior art that is applicable to human clinical evaluation.
And then I'd love to ask one last question, if I can, to all of you, which is, what is the cost of not pursuing some of these overly broad patents? Is it monopoly type presence in this industry, or is it just stymie competition entirely?
Well, I mean, it just creates so much uncertainty. These materials have so much promise that you don't want to have anything in the way of someone funding a research study or a university or a researcher picking this up. So I think that's the cost.
Shahin, do you have thoughts on that too?
No, certainly. So one more time, could you rephrase it just to make sure I'm getting the right
Oh,
nuance?
just what is the cost of not pursuing these overly broad patents? Would we end up with large companies like Compass sort of having a monopoly on things, or would it just stunt competition entirely?
Well, we can see that just drawing from what has happened in conventional pharmaceuticals as well. Companies are able to maintain a monopoly on these compounds and even expand it for far longer than what the individuals that are within the patenting space have originally intended. So I think there's one from, I think it was Roche, don't quote me on that, that now has a 38-year patent on something that should have been only allowed for 20 years. So there's some flexibility in that system where then you can even achieve a longer-term monopoly. And there's currently nothing out there that says that individuals in the psychedelic space may not try to pursue the same type of intellectual property strategy as that in a very aggressive context.
I'm going to go with the fact that there are technical answers to the questions, and they probably did a better job than me. That's why I like them being there.
No thoughts for the industry writ large?
Give it to me again.
No thoughts for the industry writ large, how it takes shape with or without patents?
The industry at large. I'm going to say that good patents are good for business and good for human health and good for flourishing human outcomes. Actually, I will say, money will trade hands, fortunes will be made, No harm, no foul, as long as we color inside the lines. Generics compete to be the high-quality, low-cost provider in the interest of equity and of the consumer. Novel inventions and the awards that go with them are of benefit to those in need also. Grasping for an award of exclusivity for information already in the public commons is not coloring inside the lines.
Thank you. I think we're ready to open it up to audience questions. Julia wants to join us.
All right, so we have just a few minutes left. We'll squeeze in one or two questions. There's one, and I think this might be a good one for you, Jack. Is the patent filing behavior of companies in the psychedelic space different from that in other biotech sectors? Is it more or less aggressive?
I'm sorry.
How does the patent filing behavior of psychedelics companies compare to regular biotech companies? Is it more or less aggressive?
Well, I think there's a range of activity. Some companies are being very careful about what they try to claim, and some are publishing 300-page applications that purport to claim everything under the sun. So there's a range, and I think that applies in other areas too. You know, the pharmaceutical world has before faced the question of what about a patent on a life-saving medicine where it's the only treatment. Should you be allowed to enforce a patent to restrict the amount of medicine available to treat a condition which is otherwise fatal? We may be close to that here with some of the conditions that are being treated. And so I'm confident that the courts and the patent office will find a way to address this.
There's another question around generics. Can any insight be given into the S-ketamine patent by Johnson & Johnson versus generic ketamine? Are there other molecules that are at risk for a similar phenomenon to occur?
So actually, I have some opinions on this one. First of all, there are differences between the isomers. There's been the idea, oh, the isomers are the exact same. And again, I'm not a chemist, but you have to kind of know your way around this. An isomer is if you have a molecule, if you have your hand, you put it in front of a mirror, the right hand becomes the left hand, but they're the same hand. And so an isomer is the two sides of a molecule. Well, actually, there is a difference in the psychoactive properties of different of the different isomers. So S-ketamine is the S isomer. But more broadly, in terms of ketamine, again, my sort of astonished amusement when Compass, after getting their first patent, then they essentially Xeroxed the whole DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the psychiatric trade, and said, all those too. And I said to my patent attorney, is this normal behavior? Is this what a pharmaceutical company does? And he said, never heard of it. And then the next thing they did was, so I said, so S-ketamine, Johnson & Johnson, professionals, they kind of know their territory, they stay on their lane. Did they patent that if you give out ketamine in a comfortable chair with a smile on your face, you're violating their patent? And again, Jack said, I don't know where these guys get this stuff from. That clearly didn't come from a patent attorney or a patent strategist. Who did it come from? Now, as I said, if I said right now, I have an announcement to make from the stage, I got an invention. I just invented psilocybin. Now, nobody here's a patent attorney, but just heard a dead silence. And if I began to say, no, really, I did, you'd begin to feel a little sorry for me. And as I continued to insist upon you, think, this dude is weird. So there's something going wrong with someone who attempts to Xerox the DSM and say, and all those too. And if you give it to people on a comfortable couch, all those too. This is what's autodidact. I didn't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows on this one. There's just something odd about that. It does not follow the pattern of modern pharmaceutical practice. And those patterns of modern pharmaceutical practice have doubled our lifespans. Those people are not evil, but we need to color inside the lines.
Great, thank you for that. And with that, we'll close this panel. And I would like to first ask for a round of applause for our speakers.